I remember the exact moment I stumbled upon his messages. It was late one Tuesday evening, and he'd left his phone on the kitchen counter while he was out grabbing something from the car. The notification caught my eye. I wasn't trying to snoop. I'd never felt the need to go through his phone in all our years together. But there it was glowing on the screen, a message from a name I knew all too well. Lisa, his ex-girlfriend. The one he'd told me was just part of the past. My hands shook as I unlocked his phone. He hadn't even changed his passcode. Part of me wanted to stop to pretend I hadn't seen it. But curiosity burned, fueled by a creeping sense of betrayal. My eyes skimmed over their messages. It wasn't just casual small talk. They talked about everything from old memories to problems at work and little jokes that had clearly become inside jokes between them. She asked him how he was doing, and he shared more openly than he ever seemed to with me lately. And then I saw a line that made my stomach twist. Sometimes I wonder what might have been if things hadn't ended. What might have been? My fingers clenched so hard around his phone that my knuckles turned white. There were more messages below, but that was the last one I read before placing his phone back on the counter. I didn't want to see any more, not then. He came back inside moments later, oblivious to the churning storm inside me. I watched him, and he smiled at me in the way he always did. The way I thought was reserved just for me. But now I knew it wasn't. It was like I had taken a step back and was looking at a stranger. For days I could barely look at him without feeling rage simmering under my skin. He'd ask me if everything was okay, and I'd brush him off, telling him I was just stressed from work or feeling off. But every excuse felt like it was building into something larger, like a dam about to burst. He noticed, of course, my distance, my reluctance to answer his small touches, the way I turned away from his casual affection. And then one night, while he slept soundly beside me, I made my decision. If he could keep a part of himself hidden from me, wrapped up in nostalgia and lies, maybe I could do the same. Maybe I could reclaim some part of myself that I felt was slipping away as I drowned in my hurt. I never thought of myself as someone who would seek revenge, but that betrayal had planted something dark and vengeful within me. So I reconnected with an old friend. Matt and I had known each other years ago before I met my husband. We'd had a bit of a spark once, but we'd stayed friends, nothing more. We'd lost touch over time, and he'd moved out of state. But the moment I reached out, he responded with warm enthusiasm. It started innocently enough, just catching up, reminiscing about old times. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just talking to a friend. But it didn't take long for our messages to turn deeper, for our words to be tinted with the same flirtation we used to dance around years ago. As the weeks went on, it escalated. Each message from him felt like a jolt of energy I didn't know I was missing. We started talking every day, texting in the middle of the night when my husband was snoring beside me, oblivious. I was pulled into a world where I could pretend I was someone else, a version of myself who hadn't been hurt, someone who felt alive and desirable. And eventually it wasn't just messages. Matt came back to town for a weekend, and I told my husband I was heading out to meet some friends. He didn't even ask questions, just waved me off, barely looking up from his phone. Part of me hated him for that, for how easy it was for him to let me go without a second thought. Another part of me was grateful because it meant I could walk out the door without guilt. Seeing Matt again after all those years felt like a spark had been reignited. He was just as charming as I remembered, and that weekend we fell into each other's arms. It was exhilarating. I didn't feel guilty. If anything, it felt like justice. Every kiss, every touch, felt like a reclamation of something I'd lost when I'd read those messages between my husband and Lisa. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was in control, setting my own rules. And for a while it was enough. But as our affair continued, I felt something unexpected. I thought I'd feel free, that indulging in this secret romance would make me feel powerful. Instead, I started feeling hollow. I was carrying my own secrets now, lying and hiding just like he had done to me. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, checking my phone, deleting messages. And though the thrill of revenge had been intoxicating, it was quickly fading, leaving only a bitter aftertaste. One evening, as I lay in bed with my husband, I looked over at him and saw the man I used to adore. I thought about all the years we'd spent together, the laughter and the dreams we once shared. I thought about how, in my pain and anger, I'd let my resentment grow until it led me down a path I never thought I'd walk. I had wanted to hurt him, to show him that I was just as capable of secrets and betrayal. But now I felt like I'd lost myself along the way. He stirred beside me, and I wondered if he'd ever find out. Maybe he'd find messages on my phone one day just like I had on his. Or maybe I'd take this to my grave, and he'd never know the woman I'd become. Either way, I was left with the uncomfortable truth that, in trying to heal my wounds, I'd only created more. And I wondered, lying there, if revenge was worth the price of losing myself. Lying there in the quiet of our bedroom, the weight of everything I'd done started to press down on me. Every breath felt like a struggle, like I was drowning in my own choices. I couldn't stop the flood of questions rushing through my mind, ones I hadn't dared to ask myself until now. Why had I gone this far? Was revenge enough to justify the betrayal of my own heart? I'd hurt him, yes, but I'd torn apart my own life too. And worse, I was still lying to him, hiding from the truth, while we continued our day-to-day life like nothing had happened. Days passed, and though I tried to ignore it, a new tension was building between us. My husband seemed preoccupied, more distant than ever. There were moments when he'd watch me with a look I couldn't decipher, like he was seeing something I hadn't intended to reveal. A cold sweat would creep over me whenever I felt his eyes linger a little too long. I told myself he couldn't know. He was the one who'd betrayed me first, after all. But the guilt, like a festering wound, only grew stronger. One afternoon, I decided I couldn't bear the silence between us any longer. I'd already agreed to meet Matt for dinner that evening, but something about the plans felt heavy, like it was all beginning to unravel. I didn't want to back out, yet my heart was tugging me in two directions. Maybe I needed to really choose who I was going to be. I wandered into the living room where my husband sat reading, trying to find the words. "Hey, can we talk?" I started feeling my mouth go dry. He looked up, and for a second I thought I saw relief flash across his face. Maybe he wanted this conversation as much as I did. "Sure," he said, setting his book down. "What's going on?" I wanted to blurt it all out right there, to throw every bit of my pain and anger at him, but something held me back. Instead, I found myself asking a different question, one I didn't even know I had. "Do you ever miss her?" The color drained from his face, and I knew he understood exactly what I meant. He didn't try to deny it. He just looked away, as though he couldn't bear to face me, the truth finally too glaring to hide. "I was stupid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got caught up in the past. I didn't want her back, but He took a shaky breath. "I guess I wanted to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time." My throat tightened. "And you couldn't feel that with me?" He looked at me, the sadness in his eyes cutting deeper than any words. "I didn't realize how much I was hurting you. I thought it was harmless, that it was just talking. But I'm sorry, truly, for what it's worth." It was like a dam breaking. The resentment I clung to dissolving into something raw and unbearable. I couldn't stop myself. "You weren't the only one, you know," I said, barely recognizing my own voice, the bitterness in it shocking even me. He looked at me, frozen, confusion and hurt mixing in his gaze. "What do you mean?" And before I could think it through, it all spilled out. How I turned to Matt. How his betrayal had driven me to places I never imagined I'd go. I told him about the late-night conversations, the stolen moments, how I tried to hurt him just as he'd hurt me. As I spoke, I watched his face shift from confusion to devastation, and a sickening realization dawned on me. I'd taken his betrayal and made it worse, piling onto the destruction until we were both drowning. When I finished, he just sat there silent. He didn't yell or get angry. Instead, he looked like he'd been gutted, like he was seeing a stranger in front of him. And maybe he was. Maybe in my revenge I'd destroyed every part of the woman he thought he knew. Finally he spoke, his voice rough and tired. "Is that why you stayed with me? Just to get back at me?" I wanted to say no, to tell him that it had been more complicated than that, but as the words echoed in the room, I realized I didn't have a real answer. Somewhere along the line, I'd blurred the lines between pain and vengeance, until I didn't know if I loved him, or if I just wanted to make him feel my hurt. It was the ugliest truth of all. In the days that followed, we barely spoke. We moved around each other in the house like ghosts, too raw to confront each other and too exhausted to pretend. I kept expecting him to say something, to yell, to leave, but he just drifted further and further away. The silence was suffocating, but I didn't know how to break it. Every attempt at a conversation felt brittle, like the slightest touch would shatter whatever fragile thing was left between us. And Matt? I didn't reach out to him again. The thrill I'd once felt was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that wouldn't let up. It was a strange, empty feeling, knowing I'd burned down so much for something that ultimately left me with nothing. He messaged me a few times, wondering where I was, asking if I was all right, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. It was over. Everything was over. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt my husband slip into bed beside me. He stayed on his side as he had for weeks, but there was something in the air that felt different. I knew he was awake. His breathing was too shallow, too tense. "What do we do now?" I whispered, the darkness making it easier to say the words I'd been avoiding. He didn't answer right away. I could feel his hesitation, his pain. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "But maybe we can try to remember who we were before all of this." It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't a promise, but it was something. A faint glimmer of hope in a sea of mistakes. I knew we couldn't go back to who we'd been, but maybe somehow we could find a way forward, even if it was slow, even if it was painful. And in that quiet moment I realized that while I'd wanted revenge, what I really needed was forgiveness, both from him and from myself. I didn't know if we'd make it, if we could rebuild what we'd lost, but as we lay there, side by side in the darkness, I found a sliver of strength to try. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with hurt and regret, but for the first time in months, I felt the faintest glimmer of peace. We'd hurt each other, torn each other apart, but maybe, just maybe, we could piece together something new, something raw and honest, built from the wreckage we'd left behind. And as the first light of dawn crept into the room, I held on to that fragile hope, daring to believe that maybe one day, we could find our way back to each other. As the days turned into weeks, we moved through our routine carefully, like two people learning to coexist in a home neither recognized anymore. The wounds were still raw, the silence still thick between us. And yet, we hadn't given up, not entirely. Every morning as we sat across from each other in the kitchen, exchanging brief, polite smiles, there was a hesitant, unspoken question lingering in the air. Could we truly fix this? I started going to therapy more out of desperation than hope. The counselor's office was a quiet space, full of warm light and soft chairs, a place where secrets could be shared and pain laid bare. First, it was just me. I didn't even tell him I'd started going. Not sure he'd understand. I needed somewhere to release all the anger, all the guilt and shame that weighed on my heart. Talking about it, finally saying out loud the things I'd hidden even from myself, felt like lancing a wound, letting the poison drain. As the sessions went on, I started to see a few things I hadn't wanted to admit. The counselor, a patient older woman named Martha, gently guided me through the minefield of my emotions. There were things she'd say, subtle observations that would sit with me for days after each session, unraveling layers of myself I'd barely acknowledged. Like how I'd chosen revenge as a way to distract from the fear of vulnerability, how I'd hidden my pain and anger because facing the reality of it was too excruciating, that I'd been terrified of being broken beyond repair, and had hurt him before he could fully hurt me. It was Martha who finally suggested that I ask my husband to join me in one of our sessions. Her words were calm and gentle, a soft nudge in a direction I'd been avoiding. I agreed, though I dreaded the idea of bringing everything to light in front of him, of seeing his hurt and betrayal up close. Still, it was a way forward, something we both desperately needed. One evening after dinner, I sat across from him and took a deep breath, feeling my heart race as I said, I think we should go to therapy. Together. Just once. To talk." My voice was barely steady, every word fragile, vulnerable. He didn't look at me right away. For a long moment he just sat there, hands clenched, face turned slightly away. I held my breath, wondering if he'd reject the idea, if he'd laugh it off or tell me it was too late. But after a tense silence, he nodded, giving me the faintest glimmer of hope. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll go with you." The night before our first session together, I barely slept. I kept replaying in my mind the things I might say, the way I might justify myself. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to his steady breathing beside me, I felt an overwhelming sense of fear. I knew that facing him in that tiny office with nowhere to hide would be one of the hardest things I'd ever done. The session was brutal. Sitting there, with his eyes on me and Martha guiding the conversation, forced me to confront myself in ways I'd been too afraid to do before. I admitted my anger, my pain, my need for revenge, and finally, the hollowness it had left behind. He listened, his face a mixture of hurt and disbelief, as though he couldn't quite reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the one he saw now. And when it was his turn, he opened up about his own guilt, the shame he'd carried for even letting Lisa back into his life in the first place. He told me that he'd never meant to hurt me, that he'd been seeking some version of himself he'd lost, not realizing how deeply it would cut me. Hearing his perspective, seeing his remorse, felt like a salve on the wounds I'd carried for so long. We'd hurt each other, yes, but perhaps neither of us had fully understood the depth of that hurt until now. After the session, we didn't say much to each other on the drive home. But that night something shifted. We lay in bed, close enough to touch but not quite touching, wrapped in a silence that was strangely comforting. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of calm, of understanding. In the following weeks, we continued to go to therapy together. Each session was a struggle, peeling back layers of resentment, shame, and grief. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when I'd lash out or he'd shut down, but each time we returned trying to piece together something new. I started to understand that healing would take time and that maybe we'd never fully get back what we had before. But perhaps we could build something different, something honest. At home, we started talking more openly. He'd ask me about my day, and I'd tell him without holding back, without fearing judgment or rejection. He'd share little pieces of himself with me again, and slowly we began to remember the things we loved about each other. I found myself looking forward to these moments, small but steady, like planting seeds in the soil of our fractured relationship. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he turned to me and said, "I'd like to start over." His voice was steady, but there was vulnerability in his eyes. "Maybe we can't erase what happened, but I want to try. I still want us." The words hung in the air, and I felt a rush of emotion. A mixture of relief, hope, and love I'd thought was gone forever. I reached out, taking his hand in mine, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like coming home. Starting over wasn't easy. We had to learn to trust each other all over again, to let go of the past without forgetting the lessons we'd learned. But as the months passed, I found myself looking at him with fresh eyes, rediscovering the man I'd once loved so deeply. And he, in turn, looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen in years. Our relationship was different now, shaped by the pain and healing we'd gone through together. It was fragile but somehow stronger, built on the ashes of our mistakes. We learned to be more honest, more open, to share our fears and desires without shame. We'd been broken, yes, but perhaps in breaking, we'd found a way to be real with each other, to love with a depth we hadn't known before. One day, as we walked hand in hand through a park, I realized that the anger, the resentment, the urge for revenge, all of it had faded, replaced by a quiet peace. We'd both changed, and though I couldn't forget what we'd gone through, I no longer felt defined by it. We were building something new together, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd make it after all. As our days took on a new rhythm, each one a cautious step forward, I found myself relearning who we were, both as individuals and as a couple. The therapy sessions, which had once been full of raw confessions and painful revelations, became a place where we could discuss not just our struggles, but also the small victories we were beginning to feel. We started talking about our past, what had gone wrong, the ways we'd failed each other. It wasn't easy to face, but as we spoke honestly, we grew a little stronger, a little closer. And with every difficult conversation, I felt a piece of my resentment chipping away. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, he surprised me by suggesting a weekend getaway. "Just us," he said, a nervous smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe it's time we spend time together, somewhere far from everything." I hesitated, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. Part of me feared that stepping away from our familiar space would expose just how broken we still were. But a larger part of me, one that had been quietly yearning for this, agreed. So we found a quiet cabin up in the mountains, away from the noise and busyness of the city. As we drove, I was filled with memories of our early years together, when road trips were full of laughter and shared songs, fingers intertwined as we navigated the open road. We weren't quite back to those days, But there was a new warmth between us, an understanding that came from having walked through the fire together. We arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky with soft pinks and golds that seemed to promise a kind of peace. The first evening in the cabin was quiet, each of us still adjusting to being alone, truly alone with each other. We spent the night curled up by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, a bottle of wine between us. I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt safe, like I didn't have to guard my heart against him anymore. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, something deep and vulnerable, as if he too was letting down his defenses. And as the hours slipped by, we fell into each other's arms, hesitant but tender. Every touch was slow, careful, as if we were relearning the contours of each other's bodies, the familiar rhythm that had once come so easily. That night it felt like we were discovering each other anew, not just as the people we used to be, but as two souls who had been broken and put back together, reshaped by what we'd been through. There was a gentleness between us, a reverence that made every moment feel sacred, like a quiet act of forgiveness. The next morning we woke to sunlight streaming through the windows, filling the room with warmth. As I lay beside him watching him sleep, I felt a sense of contentment that had been missing for so long. We spent the day hiking, laughing and talking about dreams we'd let fade over the years, rediscovering the small hopes and ambitions that had once brought us together. I'd forgotten the way his laughter could lift me up, how his touch could make me feel grounded and secure. And as we hiked those winding trails, I felt the weight of the past begin to lift. Back at the cabin that evening we sat on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one. The silence between us was no longer filled with resentment or fear, but something lighter, something that felt almost like peace. And as he reached for my hand, I felt a warmth spread through me, a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, we were on our way to healing. When we returned home, things didn't magically get easier, but there was a shift, a quiet resilience between us. We both knew that healing wasn't linear, that there would be days when the pain would resurface, when trust would falter. But we faced those days together, no longer hiding our fears or feelings. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were both truly committed to building something lasting. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't done in years. I told him about my insecurities, the little things I'd kept hidden because I didn't want to appear weak or needy. And in return, he shared parts of himself that he'd long kept closed off. We began to see each other as we were. Flawed, vulnerable, but willing to grow. One evening, after a particularly hard day, he looked at me with a sadness that cut deep. "I don't think I'll ever forgive myself for what I did to you," he said, his voice thick with regret. I took his hand, realizing that I was finally ready to let go of the anger that had clung to me for so long. "You don't have to be perfect," I whispered. "We're both learning, both healing. That's enough." And in that moment, I felt the last remnants of resentment slip away. I wasn't excusing what he'd done, but I was choosing to move forward, to focus on the love we still shared rather than the pain that had once defined us. Over time, the cracks in our relationship didn't disappear, but they no longer felt like wounds. Instead, they became reminders of the journey we'd been on together, of the strength it had taken to rebuild what we'd almost lost. There were still moments of doubt, days when the hurt resurfaced unexpectedly. But each time we met it with honesty, facing it head-on rather than letting it fester. A year passed, then two, and slowly we carved out a new life together. One built on trust, openness, and a hard-won understanding of each other. I came to realize that love wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It was about choosing each other in spite of it, about building a life together, piece by piece, with full awareness of our imperfections. And in the quiet moments when he'd reach for my hand or brush a strand of hair from my face, I'd feel a deep, steady love. A love that had been tested, stretched, and reshaped but had endured. We weren't the same people we'd been before the betrayal, but maybe that was okay. In the end, our love had survived, not because it was perfect, but because we'd both fought for it, because we'd chosen to stay. Looking back, I could see that the journey we'd taken, though painful, had brought us to a place of deeper understanding. I'd found strength in myself I hadn't known existed, learned the importance of forgiveness, not just for him but for myself. And as we continued forward, I held on to the quiet assurance that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together, stronger than before. Our lives settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and profoundly different. We were more present with each other, and that shift permeated everything we did. Every touch, every glance held new meaning, as if the weight of the past had lent us an awareness of just how fragile and precious what we had really was. I'd read once that scars make a surface stronger, and though I hadn't understood it then, I felt it now. Our scars were deep, permanent reminders of our shared wounds, yet they had bound us together in ways I hadn't thought possible. As the seasons passed, we leaned into this new way of being with each other. We found joy in simple moments, cooking dinner together, or watching the sunset from our back porch. Things I used to take for granted now felt like little gifts. And the laughter? It returned slowly, like a hesitant visitor, but eventually, it filled the spaces between us, rekindling that familiar spark. We had gone back to basics, grounding ourselves in the small acts of care and trust that we'd once taken for granted. Yet healing wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, moments when old fears and doubts would resurface. I remember one evening vividly, a chilly autumn night, when a familiar heaviness settled over me. I couldn't quite pinpoint the reason, but it was as if the memories of our past mistakes had come rushing back, haunting the quiet peace we'd fought so hard to cultivate. My husband noticed immediately, his gaze softening as he studied my face. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his hand brushing mine. For a moment I wanted to retreat, to bury the feelings rather than confront them. But we'd both learned that avoidance was a dangerous road. So I told him. About the lingering pain, the flashes of resentment that still bubbled up sometimes, uninvited and unwanted. As I spoke, his expression never wavered. He listened, fully present, his hand never leaving mine. When I was finished, he took a deep breath and pulled me close, his voice low and steady. "We can't erase the past," he said, his words both an acknowledgement and a promise. "But I'm here. We're here. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know that this is where I want to be." Those words became a touchstone for me, a reminder that our journey didn't have to be perfect to be worthwhile. Over time, I realized that loving him now required a kind of resilience I hadn't needed before. A conscious decision to see him, flaws and all, and to stay despite everything. And as I made that choice day by day, the weight of the past began to lose its hold on me. The conversations we'd begun in therapy continued, but now they were woven into our everyday life. We'd talk about dreams we'd let slip, ambitions that had faded into the background. Together we revived those dreams, making plans that felt both exciting and healing. We explored new interests, discovering things about each other we'd overlooked before. One of those new interests was hiking. He'd read about a beautiful, secluded trail upstate, and so one weekend we packed a small bag and set off, just the two of us. The trail was breathtaking, leading us through towering trees and rolling hills, eventually opening up to a clear lake that mirrored the sky above. As we walked, there was a lightness between us, as if the weight of our struggles had faded into the background, leaving only the simple pleasure of each other's company. We laughed, shared stories from our childhoods, even confessed old fears and insecurities that somehow we'd never gotten around to sharing before. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't holding anything back, that I was truly present with him, flaws and all. When we reached the lake, we sat down by the shore, the soft sounds of nature around us. He turned to me, his face lit with that familiar warmth I'd fallen in love with years ago. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice laced with emotion, "for staying, for believing in us." I couldn't find the right words, so instead, I leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that felt like both a promise and a release, a quiet acknowledgement of all we'd endured, and all we were still becoming. In that moment I knew that our love, though altered, was something I'd cherish for the rest of my life. As we continued to rebuild, family and friends began to notice the change between us. They'd seen the strain before, though no one had fully understood the depth of our troubles. Now when they saw us together, there was a warmth, an ease that hadn't been there in years. My sister, who had been my confidant through everything, pulled me aside one evening and told me how proud she was, how she hadn't thought it possible for us to find each other again. I knew she was right. I hadn't thought it possible either. And yet, here we were. Eventually, as our bond grew stronger, we both felt ready to talk about the future. Something we'd been too afraid to plan for when everything had felt so fragile. We spoke about dreams of a family, about the places we still wanted to see, the things we wanted to accomplish together. It was both thrilling and terrifying, opening ourselves up to that kind of hope after everything. But each day as we chose to move forward, those dreams felt less like distant fantasies and more like possibilities within reach. One day, as we sat on our back porch watching the sunset, he took my hand and turned to me, a look of quiet determination in his eyes. "I think we should renew our vows," he said, his voice steady. "Not to erase what happened, but to acknowledge it, to mark this new chapter together." The idea took me by surprise, but as I considered it, a wave of emotion washed over me. It felt right, a way to honor our journey, both the heartbreak and the healing, and to reaffirm the love we'd fought so hard to reclaim. We began to plan a small ceremony, something intimate, with only our closest family and friends. It was simple, understated, just like the life we were rebuilding together. When the day finally came, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Standing there looking into his eyes, I saw not just my husband but my partner in every sense. A man who had hurt me, yes, but who had also helped me heal, who had chosen to stay and fight when walking away might have been easier. As we exchanged vows once more, I spoke from a place of honesty, my words reflecting the journey we'd taken, the strength we'd found in each other, and the love that had survived despite everything. After the ceremony, we spent the evening with those we loved, sharing stories and laughter under the stars. It was a quiet celebration, but one filled with a warmth and contentment I hadn't known I'd missed. And as we stood together watching the world around us fade into night, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I knew that life would still bring challenges, that we'd have to continue choosing each other, day after day. But for the first time I felt truly at ease, confident in the strength of the life we'd built. In the end, our journey wasn't a story of perfection. It was one of resilience, of facing the darkness and finding light on the other side. And as we moved forward hand in hand, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we'd face it together, stronger and more in love than ever before. As the years passed, we fell into a life marked by the lessons we had learned, a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary. There was a depth to our connection now, a quiet resilience that I knew not every couple was fortunate enough to experience. We had weathered something that could have broken us, yet it had redefined us, transforming our love into something richer and more layered. Our days were simple yet filled with meaning. Each morning we'd start the day together, often sitting by the kitchen window with cups of coffee, watching the world outside wake up. There was a calm in those moments, a silent understanding. It was in these quiet routines that I found peace, a peace I had once thought I'd never feel again. Sometimes we didn't need words. Just being present with each other was enough. That, in itself, was a revelation. The decision to renew our vows had become a turning point, a moment that marked a new beginning, and it gave us something even more valuable: closure. After the ceremony, our past no longer felt like a shadow over us. Instead, it became a part of the foundation we were building. It was strange, but I found myself grateful for the journey, even the painful parts. They had led us here, to a place of understanding and acceptance that might not have been possible otherwise. In our free time, we continued exploring new interests together, pushing the boundaries of who we thought we were as individuals and as a couple. We took cooking classes, traveled to small towns we'd never visited, and spent weekends on new trails, our laughter echoing through the woods. There was a joy in discovering these new pieces of ourselves, and in sharing them with each other. Each experience brought us closer, as if we were filling in the blank spaces left by the past with memories that were only ours. One evening, a few years after our vow renewal, he brought up the topic of starting a family. I felt my heart catch at the idea, a blend of fear and hope mingling within me. After everything we had been through, the thought of building a family together was both beautiful and daunting. I wondered if we'd be strong enough to face the challenges parenthood might bring, if our love could withstand the inevitable strains. But as I looked into his eyes, the same eyes that had seen me through my darkest moments, I felt a surge of confidence. "Yes," I whispered, my voice filled with a conviction that surprised even me. "I want this too." And so we began the journey of building our family, another chapter that held its own unique challenges and triumphs. Our first child was born on a clear autumn morning, and the moment I held her, a new depth of love bloomed in me, an intensity one hadn't known was possible. He was by my side, His own eyes filled with wonder as he looked down at our daughter, his hand resting protectively over mine. I felt then that this little life in my arms was a testament to everything we had overcome, a symbol of the love we'd fought so hard to save. Parenthood brought new layers to our relationship, testing us in ways we hadn't anticipated. Sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the countless little sacrifices demanded by this tiny life took a toll. But unlike before, we faced every challenge together, with a kind of unwavering solidarity. There were days when exhaustion would make us irritable, when patience wore thin and tempers flared. But the open communication we had worked so hard to build became our anchor. We talked, we listened, and we gave each other grace. The years seemed to pass quickly after that, each one marked by milestones, both big and small. First steps, first words, first days of school. We expanded our family, welcoming a second child, then a third. Our home became a place filled with laughter, love, and the occasional chaos that children inevitably bring. In the midst of this beautiful chaos, we found moments to connect as a couple, to nurture the love that had brought us to this point. Date nights became a priority, small escapes from our busy lives where we could simply be ourselves, reminding each other of the bond that had once been our lifeline. As our children grew, we shared our values with them, teaching them about resilience, honesty, and the importance of forgiveness. We wanted them to understand that love wasn't always easy, that it required work and sometimes sacrifice, but that it was always worth it. Our relationship became a model for them, and I felt a quiet pride in knowing that they were growing up in a home built on the strength of our journey. There were moments, of course, when old fears would resurface. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I'd find myself thinking back to those dark days, wondering how close we had come to losing it all. But each time I'd look over at him, sleeping peacefully beside me, and feel a profound sense of gratitude. We'd walked through fire and emerged stronger, and those scars, once so painful, had become symbols of everything we had fought to preserve. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching our children play in the yard, he turned to me with a gentle smile. "We did it, didn't we?" he said, his voice soft with wonder. I leaned into him, my heart swelling with love. "Yes," I replied, my voice filled with certainty. "We really did." In that moment, I felt the weight of all we'd been through lift entirely, leaving only a sense of peace. Life would continue to bring its challenges. We both knew that. But we were stronger now, bound by a love that had been tested and had endured. We were no longer the same people we'd been in those early days of our marriage, but I found comfort in knowing that we had grown together, evolving in ways that allowed our love to flourish. In the years that followed, we watched our children grow, celebrated anniversaries that were sweeter each time, and built a life rich with memories. And through it all, I knew that what we shared was something rare, something precious. It wasn't a fairy tale or a romance free of hardship. It was a partnership rooted in resilience, shaped by forgiveness, and defined by an unwavering commitment to each other. Our story had been filled with pain, heartbreak, and mistakes, but also with healing, growth, and unwavering love. We had chosen each other time and time again, even when it would have been easier to walk away. And in the end, I realized that this imperfect, beautiful life we had built together was worth every struggle, every sacrifice. As we sat on the porch hand in hand watching the sun set over the horizon, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. We had come full circle, and for the first time I could truly say that I was at peace. I had found my way back to him and to myself, and as we faced whatever the future held, I knew that together we could weather any storm. Our lives flowed on, and as the years turned into decades, our journey together became something of a quiet epic, a story built not on dramatic highs and lows, but on the steady, enduring love that had anchored us through it all. Time had softened us, mellowed the sharp edges of our past wounds until they were almost like old friends, reminders of how far we'd come. The deep, open scars that had once defined us now felt like gentle memories, distant markers of where we had healed. Our children grew up, filling our days with soccer games, school plays, and endless questions. Each of them had a spark that reminded me of both of us, pieces of our own histories woven into their unique personalities. Watching them become their own people was like rediscovering parts of ourselves that we'd almost forgotten. I saw echoes of his determination and kindness in our oldest daughter, the same warmth he had always shown me. Our middle child had my tenacity, my curiosity, and an unbreakable loyalty that made me feel both proud and humbled. And our youngest, with her boundless energy and sense of wonder, was a perfect combination of both of us, a reminder that life's beauty was in its unexpected gifts. As our family expanded, we entered new roles as mentors, as guides, as examples of what it meant to hold a love steady through the trials of life. We watched as our children navigated their own relationships, and it was then that we began to share, little by little, the wisdom we'd gathered along the way. We told them about the power of forgiveness, the importance of honesty, and the necessity of grace, both for oneself and for one's partner. When they faced heartbreaks and challenges, we were there, a steady presence, offering the gentle assurance that it was possible to make it through, that the greatest strength often lay in choosing to stay, to rebuild, to try again. The years passed in the blink of an eye, and one day, we found ourselves standing side by side as our eldest daughter married. It was a day filled with joy, laughter, and memories that span generations. As she walked down the aisle, I caught my husband's eye, and we shared a quiet smile. There, in that fleeting moment, I saw the life we'd built reflected in her eyes, in her joy, and in her unwavering belief in love. She knew our story. She'd seen our scars, felt the strength of our bond. And as she took her vows, I felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that the love we had fought for was part of the legacy we were passing on. Retirement came, bringing a new kind of peace and simplicity to our lives. With the rush of work and the hectic schedules of raising children behind us, we found ourselves with the gift of time to simply be together. We moved to a small house by the sea, a place we had once dreamed about in our younger years. The ocean, with its rhythmic waves and endless horizon, became a symbol of the constancy we'd come to cherish. We spent our days walking along the shore, talking about everything and nothing, rediscovering the joy of each other's company in this new chapter. Our love had become like the ocean itself, vast, quiet, and timeless. It was no longer about passion or intensity. Instead, it was about the steady warmth of companionship, the ease of being with someone who knew every corner of your soul. There was a simplicity to it that was both humbling and profound, a reminder that true love was found not in the grand gestures but in the quiet moments, in the way his hand found mine as we walked, in the shared laughter over old stories, in the comfort of his presence beside me each night. In the years that followed, we traveled, visiting places we once dreamed of seeing together. We explored cobbled streets and quaint villages, wandered through bustling cities, and stood in awe before the natural wonders of the world. Each place we visited was a reminder of how far we had come, of how life's journey had been as much about the paths we had chosen as the ones we had decided to leave behind. And each new experience became a piece of the tapestry we'd been weaving together, a mosaic of memories that bound us even closer. As we grew older, life inevitably brought new challenges. Health issues, the loss of loved ones, the aches and pains of aging. All of these became part of our journey. But even in these moments, I found a kind of beauty, a quiet strength in our togetherness. We held each other through the losses, cared for each other through the illnesses, and continued to face each day with a resilience that came not from some newfound strength, but from the love we had built and rebuilt over the years. It was during these times that I realized just how deeply I loved him, in a way that words could never fully capture. Eventually, we found ourselves at another milestone, our 50th anniversary. It was a simple celebration, surrounded by our children and grandchildren, all of whom had become part of the story we had created. As we looked around the room at our family, at the love and laughter that filled the space, I felt a deep gratitude for every moment, every challenge, every choice that had led us here. He squeezed my hand and I knew he felt it too, the weight of everything we'd been through, and the joy of the life we'd shared. That night, as we sat together on our porch watching the stars, he turned to me with a softness in his eyes that took me back to the early days of our love. "You're still the best decision I ever made," he whispered, his voice filled with the warmth and sincerity that had defined his love for me all these years. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the same heart that had been my anchor through every storm. "And you're still mine," I replied, my voice catching with emotion. We sat there, wrapped in the silence of the night, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stilled, honoring the love we had built. As we faced the final chapters of our lives together, I found peace in knowing that our story had been one of resilience, of healing, and of a love that had grown stronger in the face of every challenge. It wasn't a perfect love, but it was real, enduring, and deeply cherished. And as the years continued to pass, I held on to that love, grateful for every moment, every memory, every quiet, beautiful day we had been blessed to share. Our journey together had been one of learning, of forgiving, and of choosing to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. We had weathered the storms, celebrated the joys, and in the end, had built a life that was rich with love and meaning. And as we looked back on it all, I knew that this was the greatest legacy we could leave behind. A love that had been tested, that had endured, and that would live on in the hearts of those we loved. In the end, as the years faded into memories, I realized that our love had been our greatest adventure, a journey that had brought us closer than I ever thought possible. And as I sat beside him, hand in hand, I knew that this love, this beautiful, imperfect, enduring love, was all I would ever need. The years that followed brought a quietness, a kind of peace I'd come to cherish as deeply as any thrill from our younger days. Our home, nestled by the shore, had become a sanctuary for both of us. A place filled with laughter, memories, and the echoes of the life we'd built together. It wasn't a large home, but it was perfect for us. A cozy retreat where we could watch the waves and feel the pulse of life's steady rhythms. As we grew older, our children and grandchildren became regular visitors, bringing life and joy into our days. They burst in, filling the rooms with laughter, stories, and the delighted screams of our grandkids racing through the house. And each visit left our hearts fuller, reminding us of the legacy we'd created. A family founded on love, resilience, and forgiveness. I saw pieces of us in each of them, in their curiosity, their kindness, and even their occasional stubbornness. It was a comfort to know that a part of us would live on, in both memory and in the lives they were building for themselves. One evening, after the last of our family had left, we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip beneath the horizon. The sky blazed with colors, each shade blending into the next, as though nature itself was honoring the beauty of a life well lived. He took my hand in his grip a little weaker than it used to be, but no less warm. There was a look in his eyes, a mixture of gratitude, love, and that familiar tenderness that had seen us through every storm. "I don't know what I did to deserve this life with you," he murmured, his voice as soft as the evening breeze. I squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with the same fierce love I'd felt so many years ago. "You loved me," I whispered, "through everything, even when it was hard." We sat there, hand in hand, as the last light of day faded into twilight. The silence was profound, filled with unspoken words and memories that didn't need to be voiced. We'd said everything that needed to be said over the years, filled every gap between us with love, forgiveness, and understanding. There was nothing left unhealed, nothing left unshared. In the peaceful quiet of that evening, I felt a profound sense of completeness, knowing that this was our last chapter and that we'd written it together, with every ounce of strength and love we had. In the end, our love had been a journey, a beautiful, flawed, and unforgettable one. And as the stars blinked into the night sky, I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beside mine. Our lives woven together in a story of resilience, choice, and a love that had truly endured. It was all I'd ever wanted. It was everything I'd ever needed. And as I drifted off to sleep beside him, hand in hand, I knew that this was the end of our journey. But it was an ending filled with peace, joy, and a love that would echo in the hearts of those we'd leave behind. A testament to a life well lived and a love that had lasted a lifetime.